Hi everyone, my name's Ankeet. I'm a doctor by background and a consultant at Hardian Health. I know I'm the last talk before lunch, so I will try and keep it quick. Whilst I was a clinician and a medical student, I was involved in developing machine learning tools for the prediction of Lewy body dementia and Alzheimer's disease. And I enjoyed the translational bits much more, so I joined Hardian Health 3 years ago, where I now lead the clinical team. So we're a multidisciplinary team comprised of clinicians, software engineers, quality assurance and regulatory affairs professionals, market strategists and health economists, and we help people bring AI medical devices to market. So my main role in the clinical team is early product strategy and helping people generate the evidence they need for regulatory clearances in the EU, the UK and the US primarily. So we work with lots of different companies in the AI and software space, which is our specialty, across the diagnostics, therapeutics, prevention and monitoring, and also provide full stack strategy to investors and other key stakeholders. So briefly today I wanted to talk about the post-market surveillance issues and how post-market surveillance works from a regulatory perspective. But before we do that, I'll put it into context of how the entire regulatory process works, the current state of play in PMS, which is post-market surveillance, and PMCF, which is post-market clinical follow-up, and the current problems, and how industry and regulators are trying to address these problems. So this is the clinical evaluation process for all medical devices, and so also for AI medical devices. And it starts at step 0, which is defining value, which is why do you want to build what you want to build. So the regulators don't really care that much about step 0, but they do care a little bit. So the bar is a bit lower, and normally it's the customers and the eventual buyers that care a lot more about the value. But it's important to align all these steps. So starting with value, even though it's not primarily a regulatory concern, is really important. So step 0 is the why, step 1 is the what. So you have to very clearly and precisely define exactly what your product is doing and how it does it. So I think there was an example earlier about, for example, AI being used before or after a clinician's made a decision, or during the decision-making process for a clinician. All that has to be very strictly just defined in the intended purpose for regulatory purposes. So we've done the why, the what. Steps 2, 3, and 4 are the how. So there's 3 different steps you have to prove. So the first step is scientific validity, which is what you're building based on sound scientific principles. And then between steps 2 and 3 is when you actually go and build something that you want to sell. And then step 3 is analytical validity, which is basically saying, does each component of my device work as it's meant to? And then step 4 is clinical validity, which is, does the whole product work on representative patient data in the hands of real clinicians? So hopefully, if you've done steps 1 to 4 well, you get regulatory approval between steps 4 and 5. And then the thing that I'm going to focus on mostly today is post-market surveillance, which happens after you have your clearances. And hopefully, if all that goes well, then you can actually deliver some value. So it doesn't take that long. So let's talk about post-market surveillance. So as I said, it's split into PMS and PMCF. So PMS is more about the non-clinical monitoring of how these tools might work in the real world. So you're expected to use proactive methods to go out and collect this kind of information, and also reactive methods, so when information comes to you, to understand what that is telling you about the performance of the device on market. So post-market surveillance looks at user feedback, surveillance of adverse events and bugs, and also complaints. And post-market clinical follow-up is much more about the effectiveness and the performance of the AI device in doing what it's meant to do from a clinical perspective. So this may include more investigations in the real world, specifically checking for variability and drift, which is a big issue for AI tools, and I haven't mentioned it, but also foreseeable misuse. So what's the state of play in the current EU and UK regulations in terms of post-market surveillance? So I put the UK in brackets because currently the UK regulations don't align with the EU, but there's a plan for the new UK regulations to be much more aligned with the EU, and the first stage of that alignment is going to start in around the middle of 2025. So for all intents and purposes, they're kind of going to be the same, and it's mandatory. So every device manufacturer has to have post-market clinical follow-up plans justifying what they're going to do to make sure that their device remains safe on market. And part of that justification for some devices might be we don't need to do a clinical study, but in most cases that needs to be explained to the regulator, and they need to give their seal of approval before they say, okay, a more light touch post-market surveillance is okay. But for AI tools, most of the time you can't get away with it because of the variability in performance. So post-market surveillance and PMCF the regulations outline 5 key things that they're looking for when you're outlining what you're going to do. So first is confirm safety and performance. So does it continue to work well in the real world and meet its claims made in the intended purpose? So what you said you're doing in stage 1, are you still able to deliver it in the real world in stage 5? Identifying and monitoring side effects. This is more for physical devices, or it might be for more interventional AI tools. Identifying emergent risks. So a lot of work is done on risk management before you get regulatory approval, but not all the risks are going to be surfaced at that point. So there's also needs to be some work done on identifying new risks that might emerge. Continued acceptability of the benefit-risk ratio. So again, you have to have a defined benefit before you go to the regulator, and you have to keep evaluating whether that benefit is greater than any risks introduced into the system. And finally, systematic misuse and off-label use. And this is a big issue for AI medical devices because of where they fit into the pathways. The interactions that clinicians have with them are quite nuanced and subtle and very different to, for example, a blood pressure cuff, which can basically only be used a few ways, and most of them are probably wrong unless you're putting it around someone's arm. So in the US, it's different. So actually, post-market surveillance is not mandatory. It's only if the FDA have ordered you to do it, and there are a few criteria that they look at. So first is the risk of the devices, what classification they are, and if they're implantable or if they're in pediatric populations, for example. But interestingly, probably the vast majority of AI medical devices, for example in the radiology space, don't have post-market surveillance requirements, even though they have FDA clearance. And so, there is just not that much oversight from the FDA's side on making manufacturers continue monitoring the performance of their devices on market. But there is a much better and much more stringent adverse events reporting in the US. So customers are expected to say if there's a problem, they report it to the FDA, and there's a public database that everyone can see what adverse events have been reported, and manufacturers are expected to address those adverse events. So there's a couple of problems with current post-market clinical follow-up and post-market surveillance requirements, particularly in the EU. And the first is there's very limited infrastructure to conduct robust PMS and PMCF. So the amount of data that we need to be able to confirm that AI devices are continuing to perform on market is incredibly high. And if you're having multiple deployments across sites, then you need to have infrastructure in place to collect data from all those sites as well. And really, at the moment, people are struggling to get that level of information, which would be helpful for future product development, but it's also kind of necessary to make sure you're compliant with the regulations. So this infrastructure problem is more on the industry side. But actually, there's a bigger problem with post-market surveillance and clinical follow-up, is that technically you can't change your algorithm once you've got regulatory clearance. So once you have trained a model and validated it, you have to fix that model, and that's it. So and you can't change it by site either, technically. So you can't fine-tune a model for different sites or different populations in the current framework. So this means that the technological research moves forward, but it can't be integrated. Algorithms can't be retrained. So you're collecting all this post-market data on safety, and you can't necessarily do much about it, which is a bit annoying. And so we'll move on to how industry is solving this problem. So there's a few private companies that are essentially trying to act like middlemen between AI medical device manufacturers and hospitals. And so essentially, the customers would interact with these more platform-based companies, which would host multiple algorithms, and they would be more responsible for building in the infrastructure to actually collect post-market data for manufacturers to use. But also they offer on the customer side things like try before you buy, so a mock implementation in a sandbox setting to see whether the AI tool will actually work as intended for that customer. And they all have different ways of doing it, but the infrastructure problem is slowly being solved. And regulators are trying to solve this problem of the ability for AI medical devices to improve over time by actually allowing changes to occur in the post-market setting. So if we take a step back, regulators care about 4 things. First is safety and risk, primarily. Second is clinical effectiveness. Third is quality and consistency. And finally, it's the removal of bad actors. So if we're thinking about safety and risk as the primary concern, the problem is that essentially the primary concern for regulators is they do not want bad things to happen, but bad things happen in the real world, and none of the evidence that's provided to a regulator at the point of regulatory clearance comes from the real world. So it doesn't really work that well, particularly for these more dynamic tools like AI-driven devices. And so in the EU, at least, there's a working group called CoreMD, and they are slowly working to advise the European regulators on essentially taking a more risk-based approach to say, at least on a relative level, if there can be more emphasis put on the post-market setting to be able to allow people to maybe perhaps get on the market a bit earlier, but actually collect data that's more representative of the use of these devices on market, because that then gives regulators a better understanding of what the real risks actually are in an implemented setting. So that's kind of what's happening in the EU, but it's very, very early stages, still sort of within working groups and publishing papers, and it's not really translated into any guidance documents yet. But that seems to be the path that we're going down, is this sort of appetite for sort of iterative risk management in the post-market setting. But in the US, things are different. So actually, hot off the press last week, the US released an official guidance on their predetermined change control plan for AI devices. So a predetermined change control plan is basically a document you submit to the regulator at the point that you're submitting your device in the first place. And you say 3 things in it. First, what you're going to change, if you want to change anything, how you're going to change it, and what the impact assessment of that change might be in terms of the benefits and risks. So you can pre-specify, let's say, for example, we want to increase the scope of our AI's use to include a new subpopulation. And you tell them exactly what kind of data you will collect, you tell them exactly what endpoints you're going to use, tell them exactly what acceptance criteria you want to have, and you do a risk analysis on what the implications of that might be. And at the point you get your first clearance, they can sign off on this predetermined change control plan, and now you can change your algorithms as long as it's done under the PCCP, and you don't have to go back through that whole regulatory clearance process again. So I think the FDA has piloted a few of these PCCPs before this became official in December, and I think it's a good step. I think it's going to be a bit of an interesting thing to see how much you can actually shove into one PCCP and how much they'll allow in terms of changes in scope. But that will remain to be seen. So that's basically all I had to say. If you have any questions, please let me know. And yeah, hope that was helpful.